All right, everybody, this is section 12 of Criminology, which is, or should be, our final section, where we discuss kind of, okay, what now? What are the policy implications of all of these different theories we've talked about in this entire course? So, first we start with our funny internet picture of the day, which, this is supposed to be a funny comic, but it does kind of hit close to home if you've been watching the news, really at any point in the last 100 years. We seem to have very interesting priorities with criminality, where crimes aren't necessarily punished by how much they affect us. Anyway, so deterrence theory. All right, so this is Beccaria, certain swift, severe, rational choice, right? Well, first we have to say that the research on this has pretty much conclusively proven that people aren't rational. People don't make rational choices all the time, and there's kind of two different ways this happens. One is people kind of knowingly make irrational decisions. They understand it's irrational, they know it's irrational, and they do it anyway. And the other aspect to this is people can't agree on what's rational, right? I mean, there's some instances where it's pretty obvious, right? Like you don't want to put your hand on a burning stove, right? But other times it's not that easy to get people to agree on what exactly rational even means, right? So people aren't rational, and thus they can't make rational choices about committing crime and not committing crime, okay? There have been a few experiments to determine whether saturated patrol, i.e., either in a city or a county or in one specific spot in a city or a county, if we just saturate that with lots and lots of police officers, does that reduce crime? The famous one of these was the Kansas City Preventive Patrol Experiment, which was many, many, many years ago. But they essentially found no difference between saturated patrol and zero patrol. On the other hand, there is somewhat of there's some evidence that if you do it in very specific places, you can reduce crime. So, for instance, Bourbon Street in New Orleans, or if your city has like a downtown bar area where lots of crime tends to happen. If you have like small, like a few square blocks kind of areas, saturated patrol can actually work to reduce crime there. But then the question becomes, is it reducing crime, or is it just moving where the crime happens, right? When the bad guys see that the police are there, do they just shift over a couple of blocks? That's a harder question to answer, right? Domestic violence and drunk driving. So essentially what the research shows on these is that arrests for domestic violence and drunk driving does reduce recidivism for those crimes if that person has something to lose, right? Going back to stakes and conformity. So if you have a job and you have, a family and a house and all those other kind of things that you've worked hard for, it really does lower, policies making it clear that DUI there are certain policies for drunk driving, like where they stop everybody, checkpoints. There's no refusal weekends that they did back in Texas when I lived in Texas, I remember. Those kind of policies, mandatory arrests for domestic violence, those kind of things can in fact reduce recidivism for those crimes, but only if the person has something to lose. If they don't have a job, if they don't have a family, deterrence just kind of doesn't work for those people, okay? Excuse me. All right. Scared Straight. Scared Straight was a famous program. I think it started back in the 70s. And then just relatively recently in the 2000s, A&E made a television show called Beyond Scared Straight. And essentially the program is you get kids into a jail, you get the officers or the inmates to kind of scare them into not coming back, right? So they take these at-risk youth and try to scare them into going straight, right? They've done research after research after research on this, and essentially it doesn't work. If anything, it causes people to be more likely to go to jail or prison later in life, because it's hard to explain why, and it's hard to even know why. But essentially, they get scared for a short time, but then as time goes on, they look back on that jail or prison experience that they had and go, oh, that wasn't so bad. And thus, they're less scared of jail or prison than they were before because they've now had experience with it, if that makes sense, right? Three strikes laws. There's mixed research on these, and of course, it's even more difficult because not every state does their three strikes laws the same way, right? Not every state has three strikes laws, and not even in the states that do have them, they don't always do them the same way, right? So California's three strikes law is very different from Missouri's three strikes law. There's mixed research on these. Some say it reduces crime, some say it has no effect on crime, but then there's some studies that say it actually increases crime. Because if you already have two strikes and you're going to, I don't know, kidnap somebody or rob a bank, right, you know you're going to jail or to prison for the rest of your life if you get caught anyway, so why not just kill the people? Like, there's no increased punishment for it, so just make it harder to figure out who I am, right? So I'm just going to kill the person instead of, letting them go at the end of the crime. There's also a lot of research that shows that the third strike, or even all three strikes, are often non-violent crimes. They're relatively low level. Sure, they're felonies, but they're things like, I got caught with 1.1 ounces of marijuana or something, something really low level. And then those people are guaranteed, they're required to serve a life sentence. And then the prisons in that state get overcrowded, so they have to release violent inmates who are only on their first or second strike to make room for all these non-violent offenders who've now had a third strike. So there's a lot of problems with these three strikes laws. The general public really likes them because they sound good, but the research pretty much shows they're probably not doing anything good, and indeed might be doing a lot of things bad. Okay. Biosocial, right? So we talked about biological theories, not the old biological theories, not the Lombroso, not that racist, the phrenology, the real nonsense stuff, but the more modern stuff. Looking at the twin studies and the hormone studies and all these things that show there is some kind of biological link to crime. It's hard to have any kind of existing policy based on that, because it would be a political and public relations disaster to come out and say, hey, there is a biological component to crime, and as such, we're going to implement this policy because, people are born criminals. Even if you had all the research in the world to back you up, even if it was a perfectly sensible, scientifically program, you would still get just absolutely beaten up by the press. So nobody wants to do it. But if we were going to do it, it would probably almost exclusively focus on healthcare, especially for pregnant women and young children. Research has shown time and time again that the women and children who get good quality healthcare have much, much, much lower likelihoods. That child has a much lower likelihood of growing up to be a criminal, right? So, kind of the lesson there is that in the United States, if you look at biosocial theory and you're like, yeah, there is a biological component to crime, the thing that you should be pushing for is free, one, and two, easy access to healthcare for pregnant women and children. Social structure theories, okay, high risk people because of where they live and the structure of their little mini part of society, right? First thing we can say is that neighborhood watch programs don't work. They don't. That's ridiculous. They have, they pay all this money to put up all these signs and have ask all these volunteers to come out and do these neighborhood watch patrols and things. They don't do anything. It doesn't help. Research shows that it's complete waste of time, right? But if we go into these areas and we focus on the high-risk offenders, right, before they become offenders, so, early teenage years, grade school years, right, things like that, we can actually reduce the effects of the kind of growing up in this neighborhood and with these issues and problems, right? The thing that really has the biggest impact is vocational training. If you can teach somebody how to do a job, it doesn't matter what the job is, electrician, plumbing, woodworking, mechanics, doesn't matter. But if you can give them that investment in or that ability to find a job, the skills so they can easily find a job, that really seems to work well in reducing criminality later in life. Another great program that works really well, Big Brothers, Big Sisters, right? We've all heard of this program where they take, somebody older to come in and kind of mentor children and kind of have that person there that they can look up to and learn from. Programs like that specifically target individual kids with a law-abiding citizen mentor seems to have a lot of effect on whether children grow up to be criminals or not. Social process theories, right? So this is like, learning theory, socialization programs, all those things. What does seem to work is like home visitation, right? If they can catch a high-risk offender early, right, we can send them to family therapy. We can get home visitation by social workers, things like that. Those seem to work. Making sure they go to preschool so they can have that more expansive socialization, more expansive experience, and kind of get them a good quality, peer group and new and more authority figures other than just their parents, right? So those things seem to work, right? Putting offenders together in groups doesn't work. I mean, this goes back to why kind of prison and jail have a very high recidivism rates a lot of times, is when you put offenders together, they just support each other both, morally and kind of with knowledge, right? So there are a lot of criminals that say, didn't know very much about crime, but I tried something and got caught and went to prison, and it was in prison I really learned how to be a criminal, right? So grouping offenders together doesn't work, and not just when you're talking about prisons and jails. When you're talking about, group therapy, group homes, group anything, you don't want to put a bunch of togethers like that. For school programs, again, going back to the social structure theories, school programs that train you to do things really work, right? So if they're teaching you not only vocational, but also things like, hey, we're going to teach you how to cope with disappointment and anger, right? So think about general strain theory and how there's, these strains, lack of accomplishing goals, presence of noxious stimuli, absence of positive stimuli, that causes the strain, and then it's those who don't have the good coping mechanisms that then turn those strains into crime, right? Everybody has strains, but if we have those good coping mechanisms, we're going to deal with our strains in healthy ways that doesn't equate to crime. So essentially, these programs, school programs that train you to have those good coping skills can work. They can do a lot of good, right? If we put kids in an area where they can practice and train and learn about positive coping mechanisms, everything from exercise to talking to people, to recognizing their own emotions, all those kind of things, those programs really work. Programs that just sit there and teach you things, that just sit there and lecture at you, they don't. And the classic there is DARE. I went through DARE when I was young. All the research on DARE has essentially shown that not only does it not prevent people from doing drugs, it actually increases the likelihood of kids doing drugs later in life. It's really, really, really not a good program. And in fact, these pencils, this picture you see here, that was actually a real thing that the DARE program put out. It said, too cool to do drugs, but then you sharpen your pencil and it goes down to just cool to do drugs, or sharpen it some more, just do drugs. I mean, it's just not a very good program. So, conflict and reaction theories, right? We talked about diversion, deinstitutionalization, and decriminalization in that section. Diversion, there's mixed research on. Some programs work, some programs don't. It really kind of depends on the program. And usually, remember here, diversion, we're talking about rehab, either alcohol rehab or drug rehab, or some kind of alternative to jail or prison to help people kind of get punished for their crime, but not in a way that stigmatizes the way that jail and prisons do. Also ways that don't cost us as much. So there's mixed research about diversion. It really comes down to what the program is, what its goals are trying to accomplish, how it goes to accomplish those goals. But some of them are really, really good. Some of them are really bad. Deinstitutionalization, that's essentially where we try to get people out of jail and out of prison as fast as possible, using lots of different methods. But in some instances, it's just, hey, he's served 5 years of a 10-year sentence, let's just go ahead and let him go. I mean, 5 years is plenty enough punishment for the crime he committed. And there's not a lot of research that shows it's helped, but at the same time, there's basically no research that says it's hurt, right? So the big knock against deinstitutionalization is you're letting all these people out of prison or not sending them there in the first place, and they're not going to be incapacitated, i.e. they're going to be out and about amongst us, and thus they're going to commit more crime. And the research really says, no, they don't commit more crime. Deinstitutionalization has not been associated with any kind of increase in recidivism or general crime rates or anything. For the general conflict theory, though, there are still a lot of really intense racial and class and gender disparities. Some of them are getting better. They're slowly improving, but not a lot, right? So at one point, the federal mandatory minimums for crack cocaine were 100 times lower than for powder cocaine. And, African Americans kind of stereotypically do crack cocaine, and Caucasians kind of stereotypically do the powder cocaine. So there were lots of people looking at this disparity in the punishment levels for crack cocaine versus powder cocaine and going, look, this is wrong. It's 100 times different. And recently they changed it, and I think it's down to 18-1 at this point. But still, it's at 18-1. So there are things like that. There's progress being made, but there are still some serious racial and class and gender and all those other vulnerable groups are being disparately impacted by the criminal justice system still to this day. But these programs, diversion, deinstitutionalization, decriminalization, they're helping. They seem to be helping. And if they're not helping, they're definitely not hurting. So, that's the end of our talk about policies. Thank you very much for watching. I really appreciate it. Thanks, guys.